Alright, hello and welcome back to my channel. So today's video is about soldering. I was talking to Vu at HGLRC.com, and he was claiming that some of the boards that he was getting back that people claimed was a bad board, he actually noticed some problems with soldering. Okay, and he wanted me to make a video about soldering. A lot of new people are coming into the hobby, but there's also some people that have been in the hobby for a while and still just do not solder very well. A lot of times they do common mistakes such as cold welds, or they heat up the pads too hot and they actually either delaminate the board or damage the pins or the pads on the boards. So let's begin with the most common one, and that is cold solder joints. What a cold solder joint is is that the joint itself didn't get enough heat for the solder to take and fully solidify, and also fully heat up this part and the pad to make a proper connection. Okay. The other issue is that some people tend to shake a little bit when they're putting the two pieces, the wire and the pad together, and they're soldering, they're shaking the wire while the solder is still in liquid form and hasn't fully solidified, and that can also cause a cold solder joint. The third thing is people tend to blow on their solder joints to kind of cool them down faster. You never want to do that. That is also a cold solder joint. Cold solder joints are a problem in two different ways. Electrically, they could actually cause higher resistance, but mechanically is the real big problem, is that it's not a good joint. It's not something that is solid. So as your quadcopter is flying, your wires are vibrating, you can actually end up breaking it right off the pad, and then your quadcopter falls to the ground and further damage is caused. The second mistake is getting the pads too hot, like I mentioned before, and the two problems with that is that these boards here, we as customers are expecting more functions from these boards in a smaller form factor. So manufacturers have no choice but to go with a multi-layered board. Some of these boards could have up to 8 layers in them. Okay? That's why you have subcomponents on the back, or on the bottom of the boards, and also on the top. Okay? So these pads right here do not go all the way through. In fact, on the back here, there's another subcomponent, as you can see probably here. Okay? And let me unplug the two here. So you can see there's no pads coming all the way through. There's subcomponents on the back where there's pads on the top. So if you get this pad too hot, you can actually delaminate the pad off of the board, either fully and scrub off the pad completely where it just slides off, or you can do something where it delaminates off there, but it's still making some continuity. And maybe the problem doesn't show up your first flight, maybe it doesn't show up your 5th flight, but either your 6th flight, 10th flight, or your first wreck, all of a sudden now you have a major problem. And you can't figure out what the problem is because the wire is still attached to the actual board, but you're not getting anything out of this wire. So you're naturally thinking, well, one of these subcomponents must have went bad, when all the time it was this pad right here. Okay. The other common mistake guys make when they build quadcopters is they don't allow enough slack for their wire on their pads, so the wires are pulled too tight, and in case of a wreck, it could lift up the pad completely off the board, or it could just lift it up partially, where you have not full continuity, not full connection to the board itself. When you get the board hot, you can delaminate the whole board. Because heat makes things expand. So you can actually end up delaminating the different layers inside the board and damaging the board and not know it. So never overheat or run your soldering iron too hot on these boards, because you could cause some serious problems. And some of these problems, the most frustrating problems of them all, is when it's intermittent, where sometimes it works and then all of a sudden my next flight, it just fell out of the sky, and it's done that a couple of times. yeah, that's the worst to have because it's really difficult to diagnose sometimes when you have intermittent problems. So overheating is not good. When it comes to wire, when you overheat a wire, you can actually temper the copper itself in the wire and make it more brittle. And so a lot of times you'll see that, especially on that cheaper wire that's not siliconed. It's not a silicon wire. It's got that plastic junk on it. And I'm seeing more and more manufacturers getting away from that. But let's take a look at my favorite people I like to beat up on. And that was Runcam. Runcam used to use this wire a lot. And what happens is when you're using too much heat, or pretty much any heat, the sheathing starts to melt back, okay, on the wire itself. And what happens is you actually create, the wire becomes very tempered, or it takes the temper out of the wire. And so the wire becomes brittle. The sheathing is also now stiffened because now it's shrunk up on itself and melted. So it becomes very stiff right here, and that leads to broken solder joints as well. You're breaking right after your solder connection. So instead of breaking at the connection, it breaks it right after the connection. And I've seen that a lot, even on my own builds when using this cheap crap wire. So you have to be cautious of that. The best thing to do, of course, on all of your wire, and standard practice, is to pre-tin all of your wires. So that means if I was going to wire this onto a board, I would go ahead and put I'd sheath these back. I'd peel back the sheathing here, and then I would put solder on here, solder on there, solder on here, and solder on here. And if it does start to melt the sheathing back, then I can just cut the wires a little bit here, okay, and make it so it's the proper length. Because the last thing you want to do, and I've seen this with some builds, is the last thing you'd want to do is this is melted back, and you have the other one next, adjacent to it, melted back, and in an accident they cross over and they short out those two pads. Okay, I've actually seen that happen as well. Also with wiring, you'll also notice, and you probably have noticed this, you probably noticed this with your battery lead wire, is that when you get the battery lead wire too hot and you start soldering it, all of a sudden after the connection on the board, so like this PDB right here, right after this connection, this is the part I want to solder right here, but all the way back here the wire starts getting really stiff for some reason. Well, that's because it creates a wicking effect. When you're dealing with stranded wire, copper wire, it can actually start wicking up the solder in underneath the sheathing, okay? The problem with that is, of course, now you have a really stiff wire where you don't want one, and you're trying to fold it over, you're trying to bend it into your build, and because it's stiff now and you go to bend it, then you rip off this pad, or it becomes semi-detached, like I was talking about earlier, or the wire can actually break underneath the sheathing and you're not even knowing it. Okay, it might not show up. It might have continuity because it's pushed together, but then all of a sudden in an accident, it's no longer pushed together, and there's actually no solid connection there anymore. So the wire's actually, and I've seen that too. So those are just some of the things you got to think about when you're soldering. And those are the common mistakes that I see. You never want to blow on anything. Helping hands like the setup I have here, I wouldn't recommend this purple one. It's actually way too stiff for what we're using it for. It's cheap, but there's an orange one I think out there, and it actually has a smaller diameter of these tubes. It actually works much, much better. This one will test your patience to no end, to a point where you just want to throw it out in the yard. Trust that. So the first thing you want to do is make sure that you have the proper solder, okay? And the proper solder you want to use is a 6337. So that's 63% tin, 37% lead. And then I like using this stuff because I've used it for years as a professional. I'm a professional electrician. I rewind electric motors for a living. And this is what we use in the industry. Okay, this is Kester. And Kester is known very, very well in the industry. In fact, this is some of the best solder you can buy. It's $30 for this gigantic spool. You can get smaller spools of it, but this spool here will last you for years, years and years. $30 on Amazon, okay? It also has the number 44 flux, okay? Or I'm sorry, the rosin core. So 44 rosin, what does that mean? Well, that is what makes this solder special. This Kester stuff is really, really special. What it is that the rosin, the stuff in the middle, that's kind of in liquid form when you heat up your soldering iron on your solder, is formulated especially so that when you start to solder with it, the rosin itself, rosin is made of like a tree substance out of trees, like a tree sap of some kind. And that's really not the most important part. The most important part is, of course, the acids that are used within the rosin. Okay, the rosin is more like, it's kind of like grease. Grease is made of wax and then petroleum product. So the wax itself, the paraffin wax, is just a substrate for the oil, the petroleum product, to attach to and kind of be in more of a solid form. And so when the bearing gets warmed up or hot, the paraffin wax begins to melt and starts to automatically lubricate the bearing. It's the same thing when you're dealing with rosin cores. Okay, the rosin itself is just like the paraffin wax. It's just to hold the acids that are within the flux. Okay, and what these acids do is that they clean the surface of the copper wire and also of the pad from oxidation. That's what it does. We don't see the oxidation on the copper, but we know that copper oxidizes, eventually turns green when it gets bad enough. We don't see that with the naked eye, but there's actually always a level of oxidation on raw copper. And so the acids that are within inside this rosin cleans the surface as it heats it up. Okay? So you want to use the proper solder. Do not, never, ever, 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 ever use the junk that you get from Ace Hardware, Home Depot, the automotive store that's 60/40. Do not use that stuff. That stuff is great for fixing copper plumbing in your house and maybe larger gauged wire, like we're talking 14 gauge, 12 gauge, 10 gauge, 8 gauge wire, but it's not good for doing small jobs like we are currently doing on our quadcopters. Not only that, but some of their rosin core can actually end up being conductive. And what that means is that now you're starting to solder with the crappy solder, and the rosin itself begins to melt, and especially if you're using too hot of a setting on your iron, it'll actually start to turn like a brownish color or a blackish color, and it becomes conductive. So you can actually end up shorting out pads together and not even know it. Or what's even worse, especially if you're using the fat wire like this stuff here, the rosin can actually start flowing, the rosin in the flux can actually start flowing, sorry, I think I bumped the camera, underneath other subcomponents, shorting them out. And I've actually had that happen. I had that happen on an ESC about 4 years ago. I was using some, I ran out of the good solder. I thought, what the heck, I know it's wrong, but I'll go down to Ace, I'll get some solder. I came back, I was doing some welding on it, and then I fired up the copter, and underneath one of the subcomponents, it actually started to spark and arc. And it was because of that rosin core. That rosin core was actually conductive. Okay, so what's nice about this core here is that you don't have to clean it up after it's done. You can just leave it right back on the board. So that's also very nice as well. So solder is extraordinarily important. Do not go cheap on it. The other thing you will never, ever, 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 ever want to go cheap on is your soldering iron. Okay, guys? Never weld with a soldering iron that has no temperature control. You don't know how hot that thing is. You don't know if you have it too hot or too cold. Always get a soldering iron, even the ones out in the field to do repairs on your quadcopters. Get ones that actually have some kind of temperature control. Otherwise, you're completely in the dark. You don't know if you're going to create a cold solder joint or if you're going to end up overheating a pad and damaging it on the board. You just don't know. At home, at work, I use an $800 Weller unit because it's a professional unit, it's a commercial unit. The thing's going to last 20 years at least. But here at home, I don't need an $800 Weller. So what I did is I picked up this one off of here. I'll show a picture of it right now. It's the 898D Plus. And I've had it for 2 years now, and it works wonderful, okay? It works wonderful. It comes with a variety of good tips. It comes with a good sponge. And it also comes with this here, okay? A hot air gun, or a reheater, if you will. And it comes with a few different tips. And what's nice about this is when I'm doing shrink tubing, it just makes the job so much nicer. Plus, I'm not overheating parts that I don't want to overheat. Okay, like wires underneath of the shrink tubing. I don't want those to melt. So that's also food for thought. This is a very nice soldering station, and I absolutely love it. So you want to make sure you have a good sponge. As you can see here, the soldering tip is starting to oxidize. It'll do that. So make sure you have a nice wet sponge to get rid of the oxidation. Always make sure to have a little bit of tinning to tin your tip. As you can see, it's starting to turn yellow already. So we're just going to go ahead and tin it. Fully tin it. And make sure that tin goes all the way around. And then clean it off with a sponge. And as you can see now, it's nice and shiny. Okay, and then that's going to make it so it's easier and it'll conduct heat. See how fast I just reheated that? So that's what I like about the proper solder. It heats up nice. So we're going to solder these two together with much of my frustration and my helping hands, just to show you how quickly it is to just do it without having to overheat anything, especially the pad. Okay, let's see if we can get a better joint here. I really want to throw these things out the window or maybe use them as some kind of a boat anchor. They're absolutely worthless. And they do not hold the wire properly. So this one here actually doesn't look as clean as I want. Alrighty. So let's take a look at that one. I'm having a hard time because of the helping hand. So you can see the solder joint is solid all the way around, and it is shiny. So there's quite a bit of shine to that. And I'm sorry about my helping hands not working properly. So we'll just get rid of that tool. I hate that thing. The other tool you might want to get a hold of as you go along is this little tool right here. And what this does, just like the helping hands, it actually will hold the board, and so you can really go to town on your soldering with this thing. Okay, what's nice about it is it's got a spring-loaded head. Okay, so you can spring-load the head, and then you can lock it in place like that. Okay, you get it in the middle here, and you can see here you can hold it and you can turn the board, so you can just constantly go to town and pre-tin all of your soldering pads. This is really nice. And like I said, I think it was like $10 on eBay. So I think pretty much that covers everything when it comes to soldering. Maybe some things that you didn't know about, but really what it comes down is tools. If you're going to spend, hundreds of dollars or even $100 on subcomponents, motors and frames and all that time, actually putting it together, you want to make sure you have at least the decent enough tools to put it together. Don't use soldering irons that don't have temperature control, guys, okay? If you like this video, please leave me a thumbs up. I appreciate that. It encourages me to make more videos. If you have any questions or comments, please leave it in the comment section down below. And guys, go to HGLRC.com, okay? They have some really good deals. Very fast shipping in the United States. So go to HGLRC.com and check them out. Thank you very much for watching. Have a great day.